a huge amount of attention recently, and the headlines I've read, such as this: court fight over census tied to plan for excluding illegal immigrants. That came from the Wall Street Journal. And two huge questions loom as census winds down. That's the New York Times. Supreme Court rules Trump administration may end census early. That came from National Review. So lots of headlines. And we will talk about some of those things that are causing headlines, but mostly what we're interested in today is on the processing that's been going on as we saw the wind down of the census enumeration, and what will be going forward for the post-enumeration processes. So we're a little more nitty-gritty than what we're reading about in those kinds of headlines. Welcome, everyone. I'm Wendy Underhill. I'm the Director of Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I'm pleased that you all are here with us today. I expect we're going to have more than 100 people based on registration. We are delighted that we have with us two experts on the census. One of them is very familiar to the NCSL audience. That's James Whitehorn, the Chief of the Census Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. He's our most frequent speaker ever. We would never put on a meeting without James in attendance. And then we'll welcome for the first time Stephen Romileski. He's the Director of the City University of New York's mapping program. And you'll soon find out that he's been doing a lot of mapping related to the census. Before I do turn it over to you, James, I'd like to mention to the group that this meeting is open to the public. And we are grateful that you all have chosen to join us. There were a few people who weren't able to come, so we did promise that we would record this meeting for them. Therefore, we could think of this as an entirely on the record conversation. So just know that as we go forward. If any of you have something in particular that you want to be sure that you get out of today's conversation, if you could put that in the chat box, that would be great. It could easily be that James or Stephen will address it as they go along, but if not, we'll be coming back to that for the Q&A towards the end of our session. We do have 60 minutes planned for this. If we haven't gotten to all the questions, we might hang on a little bit longer. We'll kind of see what that looks like. And I'm not sure if I've asked our speakers if they can stay on longer than that, so we'll find out. Christy, is there anything else I should say before we get going?
No, I think we're good to go.
Okay, that's Christy Zamarripa. If you don't know her yet, she's worked on the census at NCSL with us for the last couple of years. We also have Ben Williams on the line as well, who will probably be managing things in the chat box. Okay, James, you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Do it.
All right. Let's see here. Let me get my screen shared up here.
Yeah.
And we'll put it into presentation mode. There we go. Am I coming through all right?
Looks good to me.
All right, thanks. Well, I do want to say that I'm very happy to be here with you today. I wish we could be doing this in person. I do miss the redistricting seminars and the annual meetings that NCSL puts on that really gives us a chance to get together and talk face to face. But I am thankful for NCSL continuing to give us this forum to connect and share information. My goal today is going to be to bring you up to date on several areas of interest around the 2020 census and the redistricting data program, and a couple related topics as well. So let's start with the 2020 census. As most of you are probably aware, the Census Bureau completed the collection of responses to the 2020 census on October 15th. The collection instruments were brought down around midnight Hawaii time that day. We continued accepting paper forms that were postmarked on the 15th as long as they were received by yesterday, the 22nd. And now that collection is completed, we have a much better picture of how things occurred. So on a total response rate, which is a combination of all response methods, whether it was self-response or non-response follow-up, we actually were able to achieve a 99.98% of all housing units and addresses being accounted for in the 2020 census. That means we resolved 152 million addresses, which compared to 132 million in the 2010 census. And when we say resolved, resolved means that we got a self-response, we got a non-response enumeration, we identified the house as vacant, we identified the house as not existing, and so it was deleted. But it means that the entire universe of addresses, we had 152 million that were resolved in one manner or another. All states, DC and Puerto Rico, reached at least a 99% total response rate. And this is was the stated goal of the Census Bureau as we were bringing the non-response operation to a completion. All but one state was at 99.9% total response rate. We never put 100% because we know there's always possibly something out there. Louisiana was the one state that did not meet that goal, but they did meet that 99% total response rate. For the self-response half of the program, our final response rate for the 2020 census was 67%. This is very close to what we did in 2010, which was just 66.5, so just under. We had 99 million self-responses, 79 million of which were internet, 18 million of which were paper, and 1.83 million of which were phone. The 28 states met or exceeded their self-response rate from 2010. That's important because we know that self-response data is the highest quality data that we can capture. And so having that many states meet or exceed their response rate from 2010 is a pretty important milestone. We had our Census Questionnaire Assistance Centers operating without interruption from March 12th through October 15th. That meant that they continued to operate and function as they were intended. And those were the areas where people could call if they needed assistance with responding to the census from a language perspective, or if they even wanted to give their census response through a telephone interview as opposed to using paper or internet. Our internet self-response instrument, and I know going into the census, this was a big concern. People were really worried that, census going to adding a major internet component as part of the census, it could be the next healthcare.gov. It was sort of the underlying fear. We were put on a GAO watch list for technology projects. And I'm very, very pleased to say that our internet self-response operated with 0 downtime from March 12th through October 15th. We did not have a single moment of downtime for that. So we're very proud of that. The non-response follow-up, where we really go out and we get capture the folks who are reluctant to respond, the hard to count populations, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that from our second speaker. The non-response follow-up rate accounted for 32.9% of our total responses, and we had a lot of challenges during this non-response follow-up. We had repeated hurricanes in the Gulf Coast states. We had the global pandemic, which required the Census Bureau to scramble and purchase and distribute 42 million pieces of PPE. We had wildfires and air quality issues where the wildfires were so bad in some places in California, they were saying it was the worst air quality on the planet at the time. And then, of course, there was civil unrest in many cities across the country. The way we were able to successfully complete this non-response follow-up can trace back to one of the innovations that was part of the original 2020 census plan, which was to use technology to really streamline and update our field operations. We implemented things like optimized routing for casework. We had nightly shifting of cases to different enumerators. We automated a lot of the back-end work that enumerators would have had to do when they were in the office, their payroll, their timesheets, their trainings. All of those things were advanced with technology to streamline the operations, and it really allowed us to increase our enumerator productivity to 1.92 cases per hour instead of the 1.1 cases per hour we had in 2010 when we were working in a fully paper environment. We were also very lucky in that a lot of folks, 9 million to be exact, or 9 million households, self-responded after our enumerators visited their home and left a notice of visit. They didn't capture them for a non-response follow-up enumeration, but they did leave a notice that we had been there. And it was enough of a reminder that these folks jumped in and self-responded on their own. So as with the self-response, the Census Bureau was more transparent than we have been in the past about how our enumeration was going. We posted this table that I've got up on the screen where you can go in and see the breakdown between self-response and non-response follow-up for each state across the country. But in addition to this, we also posted maps that people could go look at for their area census offices, a much more granular way of looking at the census and the response rates in non-response follow-up than looking at an entire state. So these were two things that we did to try to be transparent about the work that we were doing. So as we shift from collection to processing and then the eventual data dissemination, A big concern we hear is regarding data quality. Considering the unprecedented changes with the 2020 census, I want to touch on a series of actions we're taking to ensure that the operational changes, delays, and phased activities do not negatively impact the quality of the census. Special teams with expertise from within the Bureau in the field of operations, statistical methodology, acquisition and utilization of administrative records, and then our subject matter experts from our social, demographic, economic, and housing subject areas have all been assembled to supplement the existing expert teams and provide an extra focus on data quality. Multiple working groups have been assembled to help identify new and emerging ways to assess or ensure quality. This was going on while we were collecting data, as well as now when we're in post-data collection. And they're also working with existing operational teams to make sure that we're making the adjustment and changes that are needed. And then we've also added this data quality documentation team that will be ensuring that we're putting out the correct reports that are needed for folks to help understand the quality of the 2020 census. So some of the first and earliest data quality measures that we're able to talk about are about our response rates and digging in just a little bit deeper. So the 2020 census non-response follow-up metrics that we have available tell us that 5.6% of the addresses nationwide were resolved by high quality administrative records. We use administrative records when census taker efforts to contact the housing unit are unsuccessful, and then our analysis shows that very high confidence that the administrative records that we have are complete and correct. Completing 13.9% of the non-response follow-up workload using administrative records is lower than we expected. We expected 22.5% of cases to have high quality administrative records. The use of administrative records to enumerate non-responding households and resolve addresses was one of our key innovation areas for the 2020 census and part of our original 2020 census operational plan. The administrative records used for this purpose include Internal Revenue Service records, Medicare and Medicaid records, Social Security Administration information, and even back using old 2010 census response data. We also know that 24.1% of occupied housing units in the non-response follow-up universe were enumerated by proxy. Each decade, the census uses these proxy responses to account for some addresses that do not respond to the census. If census takers can't get a response directly from a household after 3 visits, except where, of course, the high quality administrative records are available that I just mentioned, they try to get information about the address from a proxy, such as a neighbor, a landlord, or a building manager. Because COVID-19 delayed the start of census taker visits, we anticipated that we might need significantly more proxies this decade. However, we're pleased to report that the proxy rate is actually similar to the 2010 proxy rate. You can see the 24.1 and the 23.8 on the slide. We will provide a final proxy rate for the 2020 census once we finish processing the data, as we've done for many past censuses. And we actually think that as we continue to resolve cases and remove duplicate responses during our data processing, we think that that 2020 final proxy rate may even decrease. So in addition to these metrics and the groups I mentioned previously, the census traditionally has 2 primary methods for evaluating quality. Demographic analysis is a technique used to develop an understanding of the age, sex, and racial composition of population and how it's changed over time through the basic demographic processes of births, deaths, and migration. So we'll take those numbers and we'll compare them to the 2020 census. And those comparisons will be available and should be available in December of this year, so just around the corner. The second method is the Post-Enumeration Survey. That's a short survey that's run after each census to determine how, it's conducted as its own survey to determine how many people were captured or left behind, how many people we should have counted, and how many people we did count. And this is how we calculate the differential undercount, which is one of the most highly followed pieces of information around data quality for the census that people expect to see. Those results are expected to be published starting in November of 2021, and we'll get them out, finish getting them out by February of 2022. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the redistricting data program and the redistricting data products. A little bit of this is going to be repetitive for folks who usually tune into what I say, but I think I have a little bit of more information for you now. When we scheduled this meeting, I was very hopeful that we would have a new concrete schedule that we'd be able to share with you. We don't yet, but I'm beginning to get a picture of what the schedule will be, and I'll be able to communicate a definite schedule as soon as we get things locked down. As a reminder for those of you who are working to prepare for the eventual release of data, we do have the prototype data products still available. They're examples of the geographic and tabulation products that we created from the 2018 end-to-end census test, and they exhibit the same content and schemas that we intend to use for the 2020 products. I also included on this slide, which I'll be providing to Wendy and Christy so that they can distribute it to the attendees later, the link to those products. So that's on this slide here for you. I don't expect people to be able to grab such a lengthy URL during our presentation, but it is there for later once those materials come out. Now, as we've mentioned publicly before, the Census Bureau that is, in order to deliver the apportionment counts as soon as possible, we had to decouple some activities that would have happened together traditionally, but were needed for redistricting and not apportionment. So it's going to take us a few more weeks to accommodate the changes and produce that updated schedule for the official redistricting release. Although it's not yet official, I am hopeful that we'll be able to complete the delivery of the geographic products, all states, DC, Puerto Rico, by early March. We'll be working to provide the redistricting tabulations as close to the statutory deadline as possible while assuring the high quality of that data. It is likely, but also not yet determined, that we'll move to a single data delivery rather than a tiered weekly delivery as we had originally planned. Now, as soon as I have all the dates and timelines and the final expectations for recipients locked down, I'll be communicating that directly to the official liaisons and stakeholders of the redistricting data program, to groups like NCSL through the redistricting listserv, and of course to the public. So now that we've discussed the timing, admittedly, I know there is some detail missing there. I want to touch on the products that can be expected. This decade, we have the 4 primary geographic products: the shapefiles, the maps, the block assignment files, and the block-to-block relationship files. For the shapefiles, we're providing a large number of them for use by states and the public. You can see if you look at these lists that there is some duplication, and this is intentional, and that some of the most used shapefiles are provided for each individual county, but also as a state layer, so that the work of merging the counties doesn't have to be done by the end user, and so that smaller jurisdictions don't have to work with the entire state file. I also want to point out to the Geographic Information System operators who may be in attendance that we do include the topological faces layer at the county level. This is a file that has all of the individual polygons. I sometimes date myself in GIS world by calling them atomic polygons, but they're simply, they're areas that are smaller than blocks. They're just the individual polygons in our geographic database, but each one is tagged with all of the geography that is associated with that face, so that you can build your own topologically integrated geographic database if you need it for the work that you're planning to do. As I mentioned also, we're going to have these PDF maps. This is an example of a block map. Just to show you, these are full-size large plotter maps so that you can print them at scale, at a large scale, so that you can work with them as needed. This will be for state legislative and voting districts. There'll be census block maps, which will have every block within the county illustrated, tract maps, and school district maps. I also wanted to make a point here. I think one of the least understood products that we create is the block assignment files and name lookup tables. So I thought a graphic illustration here might be helpful. The block files list all of the blocks of geography within a state and the associated geography with them, depending on which file you're looking at. This example here is a minor civil division or township file. So as you can see, it lists the blocks. We can see that all the blocks in the highlighted column in yellow belong to this, this township of 59000, but you use that in conjunction with the name table you see above, where the geographic code of 5900 equates to Providence City. So it's just an example of how you can use these files, and this is available for multiple levels of geography, and it's particularly helpful for folks who want to crunch numbers from the census and have the associated geography without actually having to go through a GIS. Those of you who are familiar with the redistricting data, the tables have not changed since 2010 for the most part. We're still creating the race for the voting age population, the Hispanic or Latino or not Hispanic or Latino by race, and for the voting age population, an occupancy status table, which has the housing units with a status code of vacant or occupied. That's exactly the same file we produced for 2010. It's the same file we produced in the prototype data products, and it's also the product we intend to produce for the 2020 census. In addition, in the prototype product and in the 2020 census, you'll see this new table, the group quarters population by group quarters type. This is a total population in group quarters. And if you're not familiar with census lingo, a group quarters is things like the correctional institutions for adults or adult prisons, nursing facilities, college, university student housing, or military quarters. So this information will be available as part of the redistricting data to help those states who have a need to reallocate some of these populations to create a new set of data from which they draw their congressional district or state legislative district or other district boundaries. Another data product that's often used when analyzing redistricting plans is the citizen voting age by race and ethnicity tables. We've been producing these CVAP, or CVAP for short. We've been producing these CVAP data sets from the American Community Survey every year since 2011. However, next year, we're going to produce 2 CVAP data sets. In early February, we're going to publish the traditional ACS-based or American Community Survey-based CVAP. And this is, as I mentioned, the one that we've been publishing since 2011. The smallest unit of geography in that data set will be the block group, which is an accumulation of census blocks. And it will be the 2010 census version of block groups, because this data set is going to be based on the 2015 to 2019 American Community Survey 5-year estimates. Those estimates are published using 2010 statistical geography as their base. However, we will also publish a CVAP based on the 2020 census and using administrative records for the citizenship characteristic. Its publication date is still being worked out. There are 2 main differences for this product. It's going to include some of the race alone as a category to make it more compatible with table P4 from the PL 94-171 redistricting data. Some other race alone is not a category that's in the American Community Survey. So that's why it's different, since we're using this to align it with the PL data. The data set will also be published at the block level using 2020 geography. So it will nest nicely within all the other 2020 geographies that we produce. So how are we going to create this second version? There's been an internal expert panel working on this at the Census Bureau, and they're expected to publish their final methodology paper by the end of this month. They previewed that report at our last Scientific Advisory Committee meeting, and that can be viewed online. It was recorded and it's posted. And there's essentially 4 methods being considered. So without going into too much detail, essentially there are 3 techniques that use a combination of business rules and modeling. And then there's 1 technique that relies fully on modeling. The business rules versions of the techniques that are used use administrative records to identify, they link those administrative records to the census records, and they identify whether someone is a citizen or non-citizen through a series of, just like it says, business rules, sort of a decision tree type situation. Through that, we're able to produce a strongly confident number of citizens for over 90% of the population in the decennial census. So the remaining 9.7% then gets modeled using one of these 3 model types: a nearest neighbor imputation, a householder logistic regression model, or an ACS logistic regression. The final technique uses the administrative records and links them to the population, but creates a probability of citizenship for every person in the file, rather than assigning it prior to and only modeling the subset that was not able to be linked to administrative records. All of the data products I mentioned today, with the exception of apportionment, will have disclosure avoidance techniques applied. We've done that for the last several decades for all of these. The important difference is that this decade we're moving to something that's called formal privacy, which injects noise into the data protect respondents while still maintaining the data is fit for use by data users. And it does mean, yes, I'm asked this quite frequently, that the PL 94-171 redistricting data will have differential privacy applied. There's a lot of information about this on our website, more than I could ever convey to you in even a 1-hour presentation, let alone a half-hour one. But there's a link here that can take you to that. Also, NCSL has been maintaining its own page on the subject. So what I'm going to point out today is the materials we're producing as our technique is refined. And then there's also a very important user note for folks who have already been looking at these. So we've been producing these demonstration data products using 2010 census data as a source. They were made available publicly periodically so data users can apply their use cases to them to see how the outcomes would have been affected by our use of differential privacy. We released an initial run back in October of last year to show that we could do it for something at the scale of the census and to demonstrate where we were with our progress to date. We followed this with something we call a Ppmf. It's short for Privacy Protected Microdata File. It looks like individual census records, but it's actually privacy protected records that have been processed through the protection system. But it has over 300 million records in that file because it's every record from the decennial census. So the folks at IPUMS and the NHGIS, the National Historic GIS, converted these Ppmfs into tables that data users would recognize and make it easier for them to work with. Now, our latest version was published on September 17th to show not only the progress to date, but also our change to focus solely on the PL 94-171 redistricting data. Initially, the output from the decennial census would accommodate both the PL file and the demographic housing and characteristic file, which would be a summary file 1 replacement for this decade. So now it's focusing solely on the redistricting data. I do have to point out, and this is the user note that I was mentioning, that there was an error found in this latest version that may make the data appear more accurate in the person data file that was created. There's a person data and a housing unit data file, 2 separate ones. The person data file was more accurate than it may actually be. We had occupied housing units at the block level was held unchanged. And so we have corrected that error in our code, and we're committed to ensuring a level of accuracy in future releases that is comparable or better than the data from that September 17th release. And you can see what that commitment means by looking at the detailed summary metrics that accompanied that release. We also do expect to produce at least one more privacy protected microdata file before we create final data. And then finally today, I was asked to include some information about the Count Question Resolution Program. This program occurs after the data has begun to be published, and it allows the highest elected official or appointed official in each tribal state and local government, including the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, to request that the U.S. Census Bureau review their 2020 census counts of housing and associated population with our enumeration records and correct any errors discovered in those census results. Those eligible are the highest elected officials of affected governmental units, tribal areas. This includes federally recognized American Indian tribes with reservation and or off-reservation trust lands, the Alaska Native Regional Corporations, Alaska Native Villages, states and their equivalents, counties and their equivalents, minor civil divisions, townships, consolidated cities, incorporated places. So these legally functioning governments all have the ability to make these appeals. However, it's very important that people understand that these appeals, even when successful, do not alter the apportionment counts, the redistricting data, or the demographic housing and characteristic data sets. And if you're not familiar with the demographic housing and characteristics data sets, as I mentioned, that is what we're calling the product that would have typically been called Summary File 1 in a previous census. It's been modified enough that they felt that the name, a modification to the name was warranted. What the census will do is provide those jurisdictions affected by successful appeals with a count correction for their records. The Census Bureau will accept 2 types of CQR cases for the 2020 census. We have something called a living quarter count or a boundary issue. The living quarter count actually has 2 subtypes. It's geocoding or coverage. So you can see by looking on these diagrams, if we look at the geocoding one first, you can see the jurisdiction, the area in white. If they submit an appeal and they say, oh, these areas were geocoded incorrectly, And if that appeal is successful, it moved those address points, and this is all fictitious data, just to be clear, but it moves those address points to within the boundary of that incorporated place or that jurisdiction. With the coverage example, you can see that it appears that there's no housing units in the jurisdiction in the one area of concern, and then you can see them added in. And what that would be is if information was provided to the Census Bureau and the Census Bureau reviewed the decennial records. These things have to already be in the decennial universe, but for some reason they were not included in the decennial count. Then there's a possibility of having them added back in. And then finally, a boundary correction case is a geographic change, where if the boundary that the census had on record was not accurately reflecting the boundary of January 1st, 2020, and the jurisdiction can provide that information, then that correction can be made and they can get that new count list for the jurisdiction. And I just have to point out that those boundary correction cases can only be done if there is a housing unit change. If it's just an area change but no housing units are involved, then it has to go through the regular boundary annexation survey. So in 2010, there were 3 kinds of cases: boundary, geocoding, and coverage. But for 2020, it's the same sort of types as you just saw, but they've reorganized it into just 2. They have a boundary change case or that living quarter count, which includes both the geocoding and coverage issues, because they thought it made it more sense for participants. No one really knows if a count issue is due to geocoding or coverage until we do the research. So asking the jurisdiction to choose one of those factors up front didn't really make sense. As far as the materials required, in 2010, we required a full address list for the blocks in jurisdictions that thought they had fishy numbers. But this decade, for the living quarters count cases, we're just asking for the GeoIDs of the blocks that they think they have incorrect living quarter counts and the number of housing unit and group quarters they think should be in those blocks. And as I mentioned, at least one address is required for a boundary case, because otherwise it has to go through the traditional boundary and annexation survey process. The timeline for this is on September 1st. The letter will go out to all those tribal chairpersons and highest elected officials who are eligible to file cases of 2021. In October 1st of 2021, the Census Bureau will begin processing the cases that they've received, and then we'll stop accepting cases on June 30th of 2023, and then provide the results for all impacted GUs no later than September 30th of 2023. So I think with that, I would stop and just say thank you very much. And I will stop sharing so we can get back to the...
Well, James, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to work with you. I can say, how about a little extra on such and such, and boom, there it happens for us. So I really appreciate that. Stephen, before we come to you, I want to ask James a couple of sort of yes/no questions. And I had them teed up and now I've lost my place here. The first is whether you will have proxy rates available below the national level. I can easily imagine that you need much more proxy in some kinds of neighborhoods than you do in others.
That is something that I'm not aware of, but I can follow up and provide an answer back to you when I supply the presentation.
Great, thank you. And we have a New Jerseyite who'd like to ask about the delivery of redistricting data for New Jersey. And as you know, and most people on the call probably know, they run their elections in the odd numbered years, so they really like to get their data early. So what can you tell us about when that data will come, knowing that their primaries are in June?
Yeah, so you know, and looking at the schedules, and we've been trying to build a redistricting schedule for quite some time, but as you know, between the court cases and COVID and delays to operations, it's been somewhat of a moving target. And now that we have finished collection, we can really start working through reestablishing those schedules and what those schedules will mean for data delivery. I made a mention that would affect New Jersey's expectation and Virginia's expectation as far as the receipt of the data during the presentation, and it may not have been very apparent. But that is one of the things we're considering, to be able to get the data out as quickly as possible to all states is we may move away from a tiered delivery. So in the past, we've delivered data a couple states each week over a series of several weeks. And looking at our schedules over and over to try to get as close to our statutory deadline as possible, and also to maintain the quality of the data, we found that we can gain several weeks by moving in that direction where every state gets their data on the same day. So in that case, there would not be an early delivery for New Jersey, but New Jersey would be in the group of all states that receive the data for it at once.
Kevin, good luck working that out. James, thank you as always. Stick with us. There's going to be more questions. I trust you can see that they're coming in the chat box, and we'll get back to those. Stephen Ruminski, you can see that this audience is largely people who are interested in redistricting. I know your interests are much broader, so please share slides. Take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share my screen real quick, and hopefully everyone can hear me and see the slides okay.
Looks good so far.
Good, thanks so much. So my team at the City University of New York Graduate Center has been working closely with a coalition of civil rights organizations and census stakeholders in general and philanthropic foundations supporting them to analyze the self-response rates throughout the course of the 2020 census so groups can prioritize where they should focus their work. And this actually is a reprise of a similar effort that we did in the leading up to and during the 2010 census. So we have amassed a wealth of information on our interactive map. I just shared in the chat box the link to that map. And we've been providing weekly updates to these groups during the self-response operation and during NERFU. And so I'm going to highlight some of those concerns through our slides today. And information. So James went through some of the overall statistics, so I won't go into great detail on that. The self-response rate nationwide is 67%, which exceeds the self-response rate from 2010. And I should point out also, we just heard that the Census Bureau will be publishing next week, next Wednesday, an update of the self-response rates that will include any last-minute responses, basically. And then also in 2021, they'll publish the final self-response rates. So these numbers might change. James also mentioned the importance of self-response rates. So I'll go through this quickly just to reiterate that the reason self-response is so key is it's the most robust way of collecting information through the decennial census. And unlike at the door knocking methods of either in-person enumeration, which we know is not as robust as self-response, or proxy counts, or relying on administrative records, although the Census Bureau, and James reiterated this, has provided that on a national level, we have the self-response data, because the Census Bureau has been able to publish it, down to census tracts. And so it provides a really good way of evaluating not just what the national picture looks like, but what the geographic distribution is of this information. And it's the only thing we have at the local level at this point to gauge anything about accuracy and quality and get a sense of that going forward. So it's still very useful information. This chart we built upon day by or week by week, really, throughout the course of the data collection period. And you can see all of those individual lines show the kind of arc of self-response rates day by day by state. And then the thicker yellow line highlights what the day by day self-response rate pattern was from 2010. And then the red line in the middle is what the national self-response rate pattern was, what the trend was day by day for 2020. And you can see that right at the end, the 2020 rate did exceed the 2010 rate just by a bit. We know that, of course, there were substantial differences in how the census was conducted. And of course, there was no pandemic in 2010 compared with 2020, but it is still a valid metric of gauging how well the response rate did this time around. Even the Census Bureau in James's slide highlights that the US rate exceeded the 2010 rate. But Another thing to point out about this chart is that here's what the so-called normal self-response period would have been from basically mid-March through the end of April. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and that changed everything. Not only changed the census schedule, but upended all of the outreach efforts that had been so well planned and thought out and funded. And the self-response operation was extended substantially through the end of September, early August. I'm sorry, the end of August, end of July, early August. And unfortunately, because of the COVID crisis, it was great that the time frame was extended, but that made it extremely difficult to do any kind of outreach or get out the count efforts, even though organizations were really successful in pivoting their face-to-face efforts into digital and virtual efforts. But the rates went up. They went up, but relatively slowly. And then you could still self-respond during the door knocking operation. So that's the box on the right there. And the rates continued to go up there as well. And again, eventually nationwide exceeding the 2010 rate. And so I'll just go through some of these slides quick. I won't even go into the detail here. This is just for reference that you could take a look at more closely later. But in terms of time, I want to get to, so this is a more localized version of how many areas met or exceeded their 2010 rates, in addition to the number of states that did. But you can see, though, here this map shows counties in green that met or exceeded their 2010 rates, but the geographic distribution of those is very uneven. The counties highlighted in tan to red are still behind as of mid-October what their 2010 rates were. And even the counties that are highlighted in green, some of them in some of the southern states and even in urban areas may have had really low rates in 2010. And so, yes, they exceeded them, but they're still pretty low. So this gives us you a sense of some of the concerns about where excessive or greater amounts of door knocking were needed compared with 2010 in what eventually was a shorter amount of time. And so this really highlights the concern about really wanting to know those metrics about the door knocking operation so we can gauge better what the quality was of the information collected through the door knocking operation. These next couple of maps just go back in time a little bit. You can see how it changed from mid-July through mid-August, mid-October. And another way we looked at the concern about where the greatest amount of door knocking would be needed is looking at the census tracts nationwide that had the lowest self-response rates, where the greatest amount of door knocking would be required. And just for analysis purposes, we looked at the bottom 20% census tracts that had rates in the bottom 20%. One thing we noticed is that during the door knocking operation, the population of those tracts basically shifted enough so that the population in those tracts changed. In this case, we highlight that there were fewer people who are Hispanic based on the American Community Survey 2014 through 2018 estimates. In the bottom 20% of tracts, a smaller foreign-born population, and also fewer renter households. These are all hard-to-count communities and population groups that would be disproportionately impacted by census accuracy concerns. People of color, for example, had net undercounts in 2010. And so these statistics show that, well, maybe there were some quality improvements because of increases in self-response rates. But nonetheless, when you look overall at the population distribution of the tracts in the bottom 20%, you see that it's disproportionately non-Hispanic white, less so rather, disproportionately a higher percent of people who are Black or Hispanic, about the same in terms of the Asian population, but also disproportionately American Indian, people with lower incomes, and also foreign-born population. So these are all concerns that the stakeholder groups have, that even though the, yes, 99.9 something % of households or housing units were accounted for, we're still really concerned about what the actual population count was not just nationwide, but also on a very local basis, because locally is where the legislative lines are drawn, and locally is where the federal funding streams to. And so we want to make sure that the count was accurate and fair. And some of these numbers are a bit worrisome. This shows a breakout of the looking at census tracts across the country by predominant race or Hispanic origin. And I won't go through the numbers in detail. Generally, it shows that the rates in suburban areas generally were higher than response rates in large cities and also in rural areas. And rates for people, census tracts rather, that were predominantly people of color were lower than tracts that were predominantly white, and overall what the nationwide statistics were. And this shows some interesting increases nonetheless during the door knocking operation for tracts that were predominantly people of color, which is important. Although, and again, I'm going through these a little quick because I don't have a lot of time, but this gives you a sense of there were some important increases in census tracts that were predominantly American Indian, but nonetheless, overall response rates on tribal areas tended to be still very low. So that's definitely a concern. Just some key takeaways that I've been going through. Again, the overall concern is that because response rates, self-response rates tended to be lower in communities of color, they needed a greater share of door knocking. And because the door knocking operation tends to provide less robust data, the concern is that there may still be issues with undercounts or omissions or data quality concerns generally in those communities. And so we'll wait to see what the results are. And just to close out, again, I'm going through this a little quick, but just keep in mind that the 99.9% number is important in a way, but it really doesn't tell us anything, even nationwide, especially locally, of what the quality was, not just of the number of housing units that were counted, but more importantly, what the population count was, which is really what the census is, and also the demographic characteristics of that population. So we're very concerned, the stakeholder community, I think, is very concerned about some of these questions because even though we were able to beat the 2010 self-response rate, a lot of these numbers indicate that there may be other data quality issues locally and for particular populations that may not have been offset by those improvements in the nationwide self-response rate. So we'll wait to see what some of these post-enumeration metrics look like and see what that tells us. I'll end it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I hadn't really thought of it this way when we put this group together, but I'm now thinking that for the last several years when I've been thinking about the census, and this is probably true for many of you as well, I was thinking about, is it complete? Can they get to all the households? And now we are making a quick shift to what's the data quality of what we've got. And I just want to take a moment to stop for and think, wow, 99.98% of the households is a lot. And let's honor that number, and then folks can do what they need to after the fact. I also want to point out that one of the slides you had, Stephen, teaches me about the law of diminishing returns. That was the day-by-day increase in the response rates. And it was getting to be a mighty flat line there at the end as we got into the first couple of weeks of October. So law of diminishing returns brought back to me from my high school days. We have some good questions here. Feel free, everyone, to put some additional ones in the box. I want to start out with Jeff's question, and that has to do with whether the Bureau is likely to request from Congress an extension on the April 1st deadline. And I know that you can only answer with what you know right now, and you can't predict what other court cases might come and interfere. But do you know if there's any appetite at the Bureau to request an extension on that deadline?
Sure, I can try to address that. I mean, I don't know of any movement in that direction. I know that we're working diligently to try to work as efficiently as possible to try to get as close to the statutory deadlines for both apportionment and redistricting. That is the charge that we have. I've not heard of anyone requesting an extension at this point. And I do want to just, I was looking through the questions while Stephen was speaking, and I wanted to just go back and touch on that New Jersey question for 1 second. Just because even if we were in the perfect world, our original plan for deliveries to the states, the first states were going to receive their data on February 18th. And I know that the state constitutional proposition in New Jersey has February 15th as a date there. So even if we were back on the pre-COVID schedule, we wouldn't have been meeting that trigger point. It would have been February 18th where that data would have arrived.
Great. Thank you, James. And Stephen, why don't you go ahead and respond to what I said about the law of diminishing returns? Maybe I was being too flip. Tell us what you know about that.
Well, I was only going to mention that just keep in mind that, of course, through most of that time frame, the COVID crisis was really preventing, in some places largely, in some places completely, any kind of face-to-face contact or large gatherings. And I know from New York City's perspective, for example, there was a substantial amount of money that the city and funders put in that was all predicated on that. And we actually just, well, I don't need the video, I think, but we actually just had a conversation with some of the local stakeholder groups, and they were saying that in August, during the door knocking operation, they finally have been able to do a lot of that face-to-face effort. And you can see that those response rates increased during that time. And I think, again, it's anecdotal, but I think what that tells me is that if all of the well-funded, well-planned outreach efforts and get out the count efforts, not just from the stakeholders, but also the Census Bureau, were able to have been put in play in March and April like the plan was, I think we would be looking at very different arc of increases and a very different overall self-response rate and probably local self-response rates as well.
Great, thank you. Doug Johnson asked, when will the final 2010 to 2020 census block transition files be available? And has any testing been done on accuracy for that so far?
So those products will be part of the 2010 to 2020 block crosswalk is going to be part of the redistricting data geographic support products. And so we've done testing as far as creating the file and QCing the file, but we haven't produced the actual file because we need to finish the completion of the geographic products themselves, which there's still quite a few steps that have to be done. I can say that our initial view of the geography that we built from the decennial census for 2020, from the folks who work in our geography division, they feel that it's looking in really good shape. And we also believe that we achieved our goal of driving the number of census blocks back down away from the 11+ million that we had in 2010, back down towards something just over 8 million like we had in 2000. So we were successful there. So you should see a much higher quality set of geography to work with for the 2020 census.
And Douglas, if that didn't answer your question, stick something else in the inbox. And then we have Andy Beveridge. He's got a comment here. There's a huge problem with the latest release for testing differential privacy, though the population data appears to be better. The characteristics are worse for one case, at least in New Rochelle. The result appears to dilute the population of African Americans in the predominantly African American district and the Latinos in the predominantly Latino district, as well as diluting the non-Hispanic white population in the four predominantly non-Hispanic white districts. So the question is, how will the Bureau distinguish the count question resolution issues from the disclosure avoidance system issues?
So if someone identifies what they feel is an issue in their count question resolution, which has to do with total counts, not with the characteristics of those counts, they can submit that appeal, and the Census Bureau will make a determination as to whether it was truly a CQR issue or a DAS issue, and that would be reflected as to whether or not there's a resolution to the case, or if they notify them to say that the case, the evidence for the case did not warrant a change from CQR. It's also important to note that the CQR results will also be affected by differential privacy, whether it's a record that was already privacy protected, or if it's a record that wasn't included in the decennial census, it will likely need to have additional disclosure avoidance applied to it. Yeah, I think that distinction will actually be done internally. And then just as a side note to address the prelude, we are very aware, at least through my office, the feedback that we've been getting over several years from the redistricting community is about that importance of populations and also the importance of not diluting homogeneous populations because of the work that's done under the Voting Rights Act. And so, they're continuing to make improvements to the system as we approach its actual use. And we're consistently making that argument to them about that critical nature of as a component for the redistricting data set.
Okay, another question for you, James. This is from Louis Pino. When does the Census Bureau plan to release the 2020 geography file?
So that's where we don't have the concrete schedule, but I'm expecting from just what I'm seeing and my putting myself out on there's a disclaimer on the opening slide about these being the comments of the speaker and not of the agency. So this falls directly under that clause, but I'm thinking that we will have all of the geography files to all of the states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico by the end of the first week of March.
Okay, and we have a question from Hansi Lawang, who you probably know is a reporter for National Public Radio. He asks, has the Census Bureau received any requests from any states or other stakeholders for citizenship data on the PL 94-171 file? Any requests come in since September, and if so, from whom?
I can't say that. I can say the Redistricting Data Office has not received any of those requests. I can't say that the Census Bureau has not. I can't speak for the agency as a whole.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions that relate to 2030, but so this is your last chance, everyone, to put something in the chat, even if you just say that you want to ask a question, and we'll give you the time to do it. My two questions about the census relate to whether, I know you're always in a continuous improvement model of learning from what you've done before. So will there be a opportunity for enumerators to either do focus groups or do a survey? And some of you know that my husband was an enumerator, so I know he'd love to give you his thoughts if there's ever a way to funnel in some of his experiences. So do you take information from enumerators? And if so, how?
That's a good question, and I would have to get back to you on that as well. I know that my sister was also an enumerator in the state of Virginia, and she would very much like to be able to give her thoughts, because she had a lot of thoughts in both interesting and good, and also suggestions for improvements. So I will ask about that and make sure I get back to you.
Can I just say, don't put that at the top of your list. That could be like a year from now. You can look into that. We fully understand you've got more important things to be doing right now than that. My husband's experience was also a very interesting one, and kind of a mix of a few things that were a little not how they could have been, but most of it be very good. Clark Benson asks, will the CVAP data also include CPOP, citizen population?
No, the CVAP data, I believe on the CVAP slide that I had, it showed all the categories that'll be there. There's no total citizenship that's included in that file.
All right. And the last thing that I brought that came up for me was when Stephen was talking, and that was about how we got to these national high numbers of completion and how things in 2020 look pretty on par with 2010. One thing that was different in 2020 than in 2010 was that a great amount of money came from the states and localities and from outside philanthropic interests on complete count committees. And it ranged from $1 million in Alabama to many millions of dollars in California. What I'm thinking is that next time for 2030, I'm going to guess that states are going to put that same kind of money in possibly a little earlier, because it appears from Stephen's comments that that money paid off in getting the message out. Stephen, if you want to say anything about that, or James, that's fine. That's just my guess is that this won't go away, that states will be back with outside funding for the census the next time around. Stephen, for you first.
Well, the state support of outreach efforts is definitely uneven. A number of states really spent a huge amount of money. Some states spent almost none. And the philanthropic community really stepped up to the plate nationwide. And one really good aspect of what their contribution was is that effort started pretty early. We were involved, like I said, in 2010, leading up to the 2010 census with interactive maps in all of the hard to count areas. And that wasn't until like 2009. This time around, the philanthropic community and civil rights groups and stakeholders started the planning process in 2015, 2016. Thank goodness they did, not only because of all of the difficulties from the White House, but also because, of course, we had a pandemic, which no one, of course, could plan for. Hopefully that will continue, when we lead up to 2030.
And James, do you have thoughts about state and philanthropic contributions to the success of the census this time or for 2030?
All I can say is from what I know, it is an invaluable part of the work of getting people to respond and making sure people are aware about the census, making sure that they understand how to get in touch with the census and how to respond, to make sure that bad actors don't interfere. The Census Bureau is extremely grateful for all of the support, the unprecedented support that we had from the philanthropic community, from the public, from community service organizations, just across the board. It was bigger and better than it's ever been, and we're very thankful for that.
Thank you. Now, I know it's 1:02, so for those of you who need to leave, feel free. We've got a few more questions coming in, and if Stephen and James can hang on for those, that would be great. But I do want to thank everyone who has been with us for this length of time. And I know that James and Stephen are both open to receiving questions from you all. If James and Stephen, if you would be willing to put your email addresses in the chat box, then you would prove that I meant what I said, that you're willing to be responsive to anybody that going along here. Mickey responded saying that this is a very excellent time to be thinking about the 2030 census and how the partnerships can be even stronger, and can we get that moving earlier? I think the philanthropic community would be interested in that, and I think the U.S. Census Bureau would be interested in that as well. And I hope that the philanthropic community, and I certainly know with Chrissy Zamarripa here at NCSL, will be bundling up what did happen amongst the states this year. Let's see, I did want to ask on behalf of Clark, what's the status of the reassignment of the group quarters persons and the deduplication aspect?
That, I apologize, is a little more in the weeds than I'm aware of. I know that they're currently in the process of pulling all the files together from all the different modes in which it was collected, making sure that they have the final address lists all for processing forms. But I do not know the specifics around things like reassignment of GQ persons and deduplication. I do know that it's all happening in the very near future.
And then Garrett asks, is the final operations plan for data processing? I've got something in my way here. Hang on. I can't see it.
I can see his question.
Great, then you ask it and you answer it.
Yeah. So the question from Garrett is the final operational plan for data processing and census responses still applicable? This is, again, me speaking from myself and not necessarily for the agency, but because I haven't actually read the data processing final operational plan, but from the discussions that I've had and the things that I've heard, the spirit of that plan is still operational. There may be some additional, I know that there was a mention yesterday that there was a master address file quality check that we really didn't feel needed to be done because we'd already done multiple quality checks through the entire process of the census. So that was removed, but it's my understanding that the remainder of the plan is still in place. It's just being done more efficiently. Al Fontenot mentioned during his press briefing the other day that technology is playing a big part in that. We've got more horsepower for some of these operations that's allowing it to run faster. We're having people work nights and weekends. But I believe the spirit and the content of that plan is still intact.
James, that was such a wonderful bridge to my closing, which is to say, I know you've been working nights and weekends. Stephen, I'm fairly sure in the final days, you were also working nights and weekends. And I know that many of the people who are on the line here are working nights and weekends, if not only about the census, but about the upcoming election and getting prepared for redistricting next year. So with that, with nothing extra from the audience, I just want to say to everyone that I appreciate that you are willing to spend this time with us, and that we want you to stay safe, stay calm, and stay connected with us. So with that, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.